The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Mason Carter approached the abandoned lot, following the sound that had stopped him in his tracks, a whimper so faint it could have been mistaken for the desert wind. What he found made his stomach turn. A German Shepherd puppy, barely alive, lay trembling in the dirt. Its emaciated body was a road map of suffering, ribs protruding like bent fingers, open wounds festering in the heat, and hundreds of ticks covering its skin like grotesque ornaments. The puppy's eyes, barely open, found Mason's for just a moment, a plea more eloquent than words. "No creature deserves to die alone in the dirt," Mason whispered, already late for work but unable to walk away. As he carefully lifted the pup, his boot uncovered something half buried nearby. A frayed, military-style collar, its metal tag unreadable beneath dried blood. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Phoenix, Arizona was a city of stark contrasts. Luxury homes with manicured lawns and sparkling pools stood just miles from sun-baked lots where hope seemed as scarce as rain. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Mason Carter, at 42, had chosen to rebuild his life after 15 years as an Army Ranger. His small ranch house on the outskirts of town was modest but neat, much like the man himself. Everything in its place, except perhaps the memories he couldn't quite organize. Mason now worked at Desert Paws Rescue, a job that paid little but gave him purpose. His colleagues respected his efficiency, but knew little of the nightmares that still woke him, drenched in sweat, reaching for a service weapon no longer there. The German Shepherd puppy he'd found, estimated at about 6 months old, reminded him of too much he'd tried to forget. Dr. Sarah Williams met Mason at the clinic door, her face grim as she assessed the puppy. At 38, she'd built a reputation as the veterinarian who took the cases others deemed hopeless. Her divorce 3 years ago had left her with a practice, a mountain of debt, and a determination that occasionally bordered on stubbornness. "He's severely malnourished," she said, gently examining the trembling animal. "These ticks have been feeding on him for weeks. I'm amazed he's still alive." The triage room became a flurry of activity as technicians carefully documented each wound, each parasite. The puppy's temperature was dangerously low, his gums nearly white from anemia. Sarah named him Atlas, a small body carrying an enormous burden. Elaine Patterson arrived shortly after, her 78-year-old hands steady despite arthritis as she helped clean wounds. The retired nurse volunteered 3 days a week, bringing homemade treats for both animals and staff. Her soft voice seemed to soothe Atlas when others couldn't. Word of Atlas's condition reached Sunshine Senior Living Center by afternoon. Frank Thompson, an 82-year-old Vietnam veteran who had handled scout dogs during the war, listened intently to Elaine's account over their weekly checkers game. "A shepherd, you say?" His weathered hands paused over the board. "Those dogs have heart like you wouldn't believe. If he's survived this long, he's fighting for something." The seniors exchanged knowing glances. Many had surrendered beloved pets when they moved to Sunshine, a loss that still ached like phantom limbs. The examination room at Desert Hope Animal Hospital fell silent, except for Atlas's shallow breathing and the metallic clink of instruments. Dr. Sarah Williams worked methodically, her face a mask of professional detachment that belied the anger building inside her. Each tick she removed from the puppy's body told a story of neglect so profound it bordered on cruelty. "I've never seen an infestation this severe in a domestic animal," she murmured to Mason, who stood by with clenched jaw. "Some of these have been feeding for weeks. He's lost nearly 40% of his blood volume." The veterinary technicians documented each finding with grim efficiency. Severe anemia, multiple infected wounds, evidence of blunt force trauma to the ribs, and malnutrition so extreme that Atlas's muscle tissue had begun to waste away. His temperature fluctuated dangerously, his body too weak to regulate itself. "What are we looking at?" Mason asked, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. Sarah's eyes met his briefly before returning to her work. "Best case? $15,000 in treatment, assuming no complications. Worst case? We lose him anyway." She hesitated. "The shelter's already at capacity and operating in the red. I can't authorize this level of care without—" "I'll cover it," Mason interrupted, surprising himself as much as Sarah. "The initial treatment, at least." As Sarah worked to stabilize Atlas, Mason stepped outside, leaning against the building's sun-warmed brick. The desert heat wrapped around him like a blanket, but it couldn't touch the cold knot in his chest. He closed his eyes, and, unbidden, the memory came. Afghanistan, 6 years earlier. A sandstorm so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. The German shepherd at his side, Cato, suddenly alert, ears forward, the warning that saved his unit from the IED buried just ahead. 2 weeks later, Cato taking a bullet meant for Mason, dying in his arms as the medevac approached. Mason opened his eyes, blinking away the dust of a desert half a world away. His phone buzzed with a notification. The transfer from his home repair savings account was complete. Money he'd been setting aside for a new roof, now allocated to save a dog he'd known for less than a day. Inside, Sarah was preparing for a blood transfusion, Atlas's condition deteriorating rapidly. "The next 48 hours will tell us if he has a fighting chance," she explained. "Right now, his body simply doesn't have enough red blood cells to carry oxygen. Without an immediate transfusion, he won't make it through the night." The clinic erupted into coordinated urgency. Calls went out to regular donor dogs, but Atlas's rare blood type complicated matters. Sarah started a GoFundMe page between procedures, uploading photos that made Mason flinch. The puppy's body a roadmap of suffering, his eyes dull with pain. Elaine Patterson had remained at the clinic, brewing coffee and offering quiet support. "Reminds me of my nursing days," she said, handing Mason a steaming cup. "Sometimes you fight hardest for the ones everyone else has given up on." Her gnarled fingers patted his arm. "The Lord puts certain creatures in our path for a reason, young man." By evening, Atlas's condition had stabilized enough for more comprehensive treatment to begin. Each tick was methodically removed and preserved for testing, wounds cleaned and bandaged, antibiotics and fluids administered. The puppy remained unconscious, his breathing labored. "I've seen worse pull through," Elaine offered, though her worried eyes suggested otherwise. As night fell, the clinic phone rang. Sarah answered, her professional tone giving nothing away as she listened to the caller. "Yes, we did take in a German Shepherd puppy today. No, I'm afraid I can't disclose medical details without proof of ownership." "Yes, you can come by tomorrow during business hours. We'll need documentation of ownership, of course." She hung up, her expression troubled as she turned to Mason. "Someone's asking about a lost German Shepherd. Didn't leave a name." "Convenient timing," Mason remarked, suspicion evident in his voice. "Did they happen to mention how their dog ended up half dead and covered in ticks?" The night stretched endlessly as they waited for a suitable blood donor. Atlas's vitals weakened with each passing hour. At nearly midnight, Frank Thompson arrived at the clinic, a large, healthy German shepherd at his side. "This is Sergeant," he explained, the old military bearing evident in his posture despite his age. "Best damned dog in Arizona. Universal donor type, according to his records. Called me when they couldn't find a match." He nodded toward Atlas's unconscious form. "Figured one soldier ought to help another." Mason raised an eyebrow. "How did you know—" "The collar you found," Frank interrupted. "Elaine mentioned it. That's not a civilian design." The transfusion process was delicate and tense. Sergeant stoically enduring the collection, while Atlas lay motionless, machines monitoring his tenuous hold on life. Frank and Mason sat in plastic chairs outside the treatment area, an unspoken understanding between them. "Had a dog like him in '69, Frank said finally, breaking the silence. "These animals give everything and ask for nothing. Makes you wonder who the higher species really is." He glanced at Mason's forearm, where a faded tattoo of ranger insignia was partially visible beneath his rolled sleeve. "You know something about that too, I expect." Dawn was breaking when Sarah emerged, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "He's holding on," she said simply. "The transfusion's complete, but he's not out of the woods." Not by a long shot. She handed Mason a small plastic container. "Found this embedded in his shoulder, under the ticks. It's a microchip, but it's not standard. I've never seen anything like it." Mason examined the tiny device, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the clinic's air conditioning. "I have," he said quietly. "This isn't a regular pet chip. It's military grade." The waiting room had begun to fill with early appointments, but an unusual number of elderly visitors had also arrived, residents from Sunshine Senior Living, coming in shifts to check on Atlas and bring coffee and homemade food for the staff. Their presence transformed the clinical atmosphere, their weathered faces reflecting concern that went beyond casual interest. "Heard you could use some support," explained Margaret Wilson, a 90-year-old former schoolteacher. "None of us sleep much anyway at our age. Might as well make ourselves useful." As the seniors settled in for the vigil, Mason stepped outside to call his supervisor at Desert Paws. He wouldn't be coming in today, or possibly tomorrow. Something more important had come up. Something that felt strangely like purpose. For 9 days, Atlas hovered in the space between life and death. The transfusion had given him a chance, but infection and malnutrition continued to wage war on his young body. Mason visited morning and evening, sitting quietly near the kennel where Atlas lay connected to IV fluids and monitors. On the 10th day, as Mason read aloud from yesterday's newspaper, a habit he'd developed during his vigil, Atlas lifted his head for the first time, eyes focusing briefly before exhaustion reclaimed him. "That's a good sign," Sarah said, updating the medical chart. "His blood work is finally showing improvement." "The antibiotics are winning." By the 14th day, Atlas was able to stand shakily and take a few hesitant steps. His first real meal, a carefully measured portion of prescription food, was consumed with such desperate speed that Sarah had to adjust the feeding schedule to prevent his stomach from rebelling. But despite these improvements, one troubling pattern emerged. Atlas showed extreme fear around male staff members, particularly those wearing uniforms. It's common in abuse cases, Sarah explained, as they watched Atlas cower at the approach of a male technician. He associates men with pain. This association became painfully clear when Mason attempted to sit closer to Atlas's kennel. The puppy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking, pressing himself against the back wall, trembling violently, emitting a high-pitched whine that sounded almost human in its distress. "He doesn't understand that you're the one who saved him," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on Mason's arm. "Give him time." The rejection stung more than Mason wanted to admit. He'd emptied his savings account for a dog that couldn't stand the sight of him. The irony wasn't lost on him. It mirrored too many human relationships in his life. Elaine Patterson became Atlas's unlikely champion. The elderly volunteer had a magic touch, her quiet presence and unhurried movements gradually earning the puppy's trust. She spent hours simply sitting near his kennel, talking in the same soothing tone she'd once used with frightened children in the burn unit. "Some souls take longer to trust," she told Mason. "Doesn't mean they never will." On the 16th day, Elaine discovered something remarkable. When she said certain phrases, words that seemed random at first, Atlas's demeanor changed instantly. His ears pricked forward, his posture straightened despite his weakness, and he looked at her with an alertness that bordered on anticipation. "Watch this," she demonstrated for Mason and Sarah. "Atlas, find it." The puppy immediately began sniffing the ground in a methodical pattern. "Atlas, hold." He froze in place. "Atlas, release." He relaxed, looking expectantly at Elaine. "Those aren't typical pet commands," Mason said, a cold realization settling in his stomach. "Those are military search patterns, basic ones but unmistakable." Sarah looked between them, confusion evident. How would a puppy know military commands? Mason's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't wanted to see. The collar, the unusual microchip, the specific training responses, the fear of uniformed men. "He's a washout," Mason said quietly. "A military working dog training reject, probably from the program at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. They start them young, and if they don't make the cut—" He didn't finish the sentence. The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. His nightmares had featured military working dogs prominently since Afghanistan, not just Cato, but the Belgian Malinois that had discovered the mass grave outside Kandahar, the German Shepherd that had lost a leg to the same IED that had killed two of Mason's teammates. Dogs trained to serve, to sacrifice, to die if necessary. "You okay?" Sarah asked, noticing his sudden paleness. "Fine," Mason lied, excusing himself to get fresh air. Outside, he leaned against his truck, sweat beading on his forehead despite the breeze. His phone buzzed. A text from Frank Thompson asking about Atlas's progress. The older veteran had been checking in daily since the transfusion, his interest extending beyond the health of his own dog, Sergeant, who had donated blood. Mason made a split-second decision and drove to Sunshine Senior Living. Frank was waiting in the community garden, baseball cap shielding his eyes from the sun, hands gnarled with arthritis, but still strong enough to tend the tomato plants he cultivated with military precision. "Something's bothering you, son," Frank observed, handing Mason a glass of iced tea. "Spit it out." Mason explained his theory about Atlas's background, watching Frank's weathered face for reaction. The old veteran nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Wondered about that," he admitted. "Sergeant recognized something in that pup's blood. Military dogs have a certain quality, even the washouts." He studied Mason carefully. "But that's not what's eating you." Mason hesitated, then unloaded the burden he'd carried for years. Cato's death, the nightmares, the guilt. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if the story were familiar territory. "Had a dog in Nam," Frank said finally. "Brenner. Found landmines. Saved my unit more times than I could count. Took a sniper round meant for me." His voice remained steady, but his eyes had traveled somewhere distant. "Carried that guilt for 30 years before I realized something." "What's that?" Mason asked. "Wasn't my call to make. Brenner did what he was trained to do, but also what he chose to do. These animals understand loyalty better than most humans." Frank's gnarled finger tapped Mason's chest. "Your Cato didn't die for nothing, and you dishonor his sacrifice by thinking you should have died instead." The words hit with uncomfortable precision. Mason drove back to the clinic with Frank's perspective churning in his mind, arriving just as Sarah was finishing Atlas's evening examination. "His blood donor is here," she said, nodding toward the waiting room where Frank sat with Sargent. "Said you invited him." The large German shepherd sat attentively beside Frank, dignified despite his age. When Atlas was brought into the room, Sargent's reaction was immediate and surprising. A soft whine, ears pricked forward, body language showing interest rather than aggression. More surprising was Atlas's response. Though still weak, he strained toward the older dog, showing none of the fear he displayed with humans. Sarah carefully allowed them to approach each other, ready to intervene. Sargent gently sniffed the puppy, then lay down beside his kennel in a protective posture. "Well, I'll be," Frank murmured. "Dogs know their own kind." That night, Atlas did something unexpected. As Mason sat reading near the kennel, maintaining the careful distance that had become routine, the puppy cautiously approached the front of the enclosure. He didn't come close enough for contact, but he settled on his belly, watching Mason with wary eyes that held a glimmer of something new, curiosity rather than fear. "Progress," Sarah whispered, observing from the doorway. "Slow, but real." Over the next few days, a delicate dance unfolded. Atlas gradually allowed Mason to sit closer, though he still cowered if Mason made sudden movements. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during the night shift, when Mason had fallen asleep in the chair beside the kennel, his hand hanging limply near the bars. He woke to a tentative sensation, Atlas gently sniffing his fingers, ready to retreat at the slightest movement. Mason remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. After what seemed an eternity, Atlas did the unthinkable. He briefly pressed his nose against Mason's fingertips before retreating to his bed. "He's beginning to trust," Elaine observed the next morning, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but animal hearts, those work in ways we can understand, if we're patient enough to listen." With each small victory came deeper questions. The military-grade chip remained a mystery, not standard issue for working dogs and certainly not for washouts. Sarah's attempts to identify it through veterinary channels led nowhere. The anonymous caller never returned. But Mason found himself scanning the clinic parking lot for unfamiliar vehicles, a habit from his military days he'd thought long abandoned. As Atlas's physical strength returned, evidence of his specialized training became increasingly apparent. He could follow complex directional commands, demonstrated remarkable scent discrimination, and showed an uncanny ability to detect subtle changes in human emotional states. particularly anxiety and fear. "Whatever he was being trained for," Frank observed during one of his now regular visits, "it wasn't just basic patrol work. This dog had specialized instruction, expensive instruction." The question hung unspoken between them. Who would invest so much in a puppy, then abandon him to die? And why? By his third week of recovery, Atlas had transformed from the skeletal, tick-infested creature Mason had found to a recognizable, if still underweight, German Shepherd puppy. His coat was beginning to shine, the bare patches slowly filling in, and his eyes, once dull with pain, now followed movement with alert intelligence. The physical wounds were healing faster than anyone had expected. The invisible ones, however, remained. "He still won't go through doorways unless someone else goes first," Sarah observed, as Atlas hesitated at the threshold of the examination room. "And loud noises send him into a panic." Mason had witnessed one such episode when a metal tray clattered to the floor in the treatment area. Atlas had flattened himself against the wall, trembling violently, urinating involuntarily, a textbook trauma response. It had taken Elaine over an hour to coax him back to a state of relative calm. The financial reality of Atlas's care had become increasingly pressing. Mason had maxed out 2 credit cards, and Sarah had stretched the clinic's charity fund to its limit. The GoFundMe page had raised several $1,000s, a help, but not enough to cover the mounting expenses. With reluctance that surprised him, Mason listed his prized 1978 Triumph motorcycle for sale. He'd restored it himself over 3 painstaking years, but now it represented dollars that could keep Atlas in treatment. "You're really committed to this dog," Sarah remarked when Mason mentioned the sale. Something in her tone made him glance up sharply. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Not a problem, just unexpected. You barely knew him when you emptied your savings. Now you're selling your bike. I've just never seen you this invested in one of our rescues before." Mason couldn't articulate the bond that had formed, how Atlas's struggle had become entwined with his own path to healing. Instead, he shrugged. "Someone has to look out for him." The local news picked up Atlas's story after a volunteer posted before and after photos online. The images went viral, the shocking before picture showing the emaciated, tick-covered puppy, contrasted with a more recent image of Atlas cautiously accepting a treat from Mason's hand. Donations increased, along with calls from people wanting to adopt the now famous dog. Mason found himself irrationally annoyed by the adoption inquiries. "They just want him because he's a celebrity now," he grumbled to Frank during one of their increasingly regular conversations. "Where were they when he was dying in the dirt?" Frank's weathered face crinkled with amusement. "Sounds to me like you don't want to give him up." The observation lingered in Mason's mind as he drove home that evening. His small house seemed emptier than usual, the silence more pronounced. He'd never considered himself a dog person after Cato. The thought of being responsible for another animal's well-being, of opening himself to that particular vulnerability again, had been unthinkable. Until now. Mason's research into military working dogs yielded disturbing information. While the official programs were well regulated, with strict standards for care and handling, there were reports of private contractors using less ethical methods. Some acquired puppies with promising traits, subjected them to intensive training, and discarded those that didn't meet expectations. The thought of Atlas being thrown away like defective equipment made Mason's jaw clench with anger. During this period, Mason began taking Atlas for short visits to Sunshine Senior Living. The first outing had been Sarah's suggestion, a controlled environment to test Atlas's comfort around different people. The residents, many of whom had been following Atlas's recovery through Elaine's updates, welcomed him with a gentleness that seemed to put the puppy at ease. "Animals know who they can trust," Margaret Wilson declared, her 90 years of life experience delivered with classroom authority, as Atlas cautiously accepted a scratch behind the ears. "They can sense a good heart, no matter how wrinkled the packaging." These visits became a regular occurrence, evolving into an informal therapy program. Residents who rarely left their rooms began appearing in the common areas when Atlas was scheduled to visit. Staff reported improved mood and engagement among participants. For many of the elderly residents, Atlas provided a connection to pets they'd had to surrender upon moving to assisted living, a loss that had left a void no human interaction could quite fill. For Atlas, these visits provided crucial socialization. The calm, non-threatening environment allowed him to build confidence around different people. He remained wary of sudden movements and loud noises, but his circle of trust gradually expanded beyond Mason, Sarah, and Elaine. Frank Thompson took particular interest in Atlas's progress, often joining Mason for the visits to Sunshine. The Vietnam veteran's understanding of military working dogs provided valuable insight into Atlas's behaviors and triggers. "He's scanning," Frank pointed out one afternoon, as Atlas systematically surveyed the room before settling. "Military dogs are taught to clear an area before relaxing. He's looking for threats." These observations helped Mason develop strategies to help Atlas feel secure. Predictable routines, clear signals before touching him, avoiding the specific tones that triggered his training responses, small adjustments that made a significant difference in the puppy's stress levels. Margaret, whose sharp mind belied her frail appearance, developed a theory after watching Atlas during several visits. "This dog wasn't just any military washout," she said, her voice low as she and Mason sat watching Atlas interact gently with a resident in a wheelchair. "The commands he responds to, his hypervigilance, the specific triggers that frighten him. He was being trained for special operations." "Black Ops stuff." When Mason looked skeptical, she fixed him with a schoolteacher's stare. "My son served 30 years in military intelligence before he passed. I recognize the patterns." Mason's nighttime research expanded, delving into reports of missing military dogs. Not easy information to access, but his ranger connection still opened some doors. What he found disturbed him. Several reports of puppies vanishing from training programs over the past year, primarily German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois with specific aptitudes. The official explanation was poor record-keeping, but several trainers had filed formal complaints suggesting a pattern of theft. As Mason pieced together this puzzle, Atlas continued to heal. The first time the puppy wagged his tail, a brief, hesitant gesture during a gentle play session with Sarah, felt like a milestone worth celebrating. His first bark, startling everyone during a visit to Sunshine, when a lunch cart rolled by unexpectedly, was another. Small victories on the road to becoming a normal dog. Then came the day that changed everything. Mason had taken Atlas for a short, controlled walk in a quiet park near the clinic, one of their first ventures into truly public space. The puppy remained close to Mason's leg, vigilant but managing his anxiety. As they approached a playground area, a young boy broke away from his mother and ran toward the street, directly into the path of an approaching car. Before Mason could react, Atlas lunged forward with surprising strength, positioning himself between the child and the road, his body blocking the boy's path. The bark that erupted from the puppy's throat was nothing like his previous tentative sounds. This was authoritative, commanding, impossible to ignore. The child stopped short. The car swerved slightly, and disaster was averted. In the commotion that followed, the mother's tearful gratitude, the gathering crowd, Mason watched Atlas with newfound understanding. The puppy had reverted to his training in a crisis, but he'd used it to protect rather than to obey a handler's command. He'd made a choice. "You did good, buddy," Mason said quietly as they walked back to the truck. For the first time, Atlas leaned slightly against Mason's leg, not seeking protection, but offering companionship. That evening, Mason made a decision. After consulting with Sarah about Atlas's readiness, he submitted an application to become the puppy's foster parent during his continued recovery. The clinic board approved it quickly, perhaps influenced by the substantial donations that had followed the news coverage, perhaps recognizing what many had observed, that Mason and Atlas had formed a bond that transcended the typical rescuer-rescued relationship. The first night in Mason's home was challenging. Atlas inspected every corner of the small house with military precision, startling at unfamiliar sounds and refusing to settle. He finally retreated under Mason's bed, the most defensible position he could find, and remained there for hours. Mason made no attempt to coax him out, simply going about his evening routine, occasionally talking aloud to the invisible puppy as he prepared dinner, watched the news, and readied for bed. "You come out when you're ready," he said, placing a bowl of water near the bed before turning off the light. "No rush, buddy." Around midnight, Mason woke to a sound he'd become attuned to during their time at the clinic, the soft whimper that preceded Atlas's nightmares. Without thinking, he slid from the bed onto the floor, speaking quietly as he peered into the darkness beneath the bed frame. "You're safe, Atlas. It's just a dream. You're safe now." The whimpering continued, escalating to a more distressed sound. Mason lay flat on the floor, extending his hand into the space, not touching the dog, but offering presence. "I get them too," he said softly. "The dreams. About things I couldn't change, people I couldn't save. I know, buddy. I know." Gradually, Atlas's breathing steadied. In the dim light filtering through the bedroom window, Mason could see the puppy's eyes open, watching him. They remained like that, man and dog, both broken in their ways, finding comfort in the simple fact of not being alone with their ghosts. Morning brought a tentative new normal. Atlas emerged from under the bed while Mason prepared breakfast, maintaining a careful distance but staying in the same room. Progress from the previous night. By the third day, he had claimed a spot in the living room where he could watch both the front door and Mason's movements in the kitchen. The routine they established was built around Atlas's comfort and recovery needs: morning medication with breakfast, short training sessions that reinforced positive behaviors rather than the military commands he'd been taught, midday visits to the clinic for checkups, afternoon trips to Sunshine Senior Living, quiet evenings at home. Mason found himself changing his own long-established patterns. He spoke more, filling the silence that had previously dominated his home. He became more aware of his movements, modulating his typically abrupt ranger efficiency to avoid triggering Atlas's fear responses. He started cooking actual meals instead of relying on protein bars and coffee. "That dog is rehabilitating you," Frank observed during one of his now regular visits to Mason's home. The older veteran had become something of a mentor for both Mason and Atlas, his understanding of canine behavior and military trauma providing valuable guidance. 2 months after Atlas's rescue, Sarah declared him physically recovered. Nutritionally, he's finally where he should be for a dog his age, she reported during their checkup. The coat regrowth is excellent, all infection markers are normal, and his muscle tone is improving with exercise. She hesitated before continuing. The clinic board is asking when he'll be ready for permanent adoption. We've had several excellent applications from families with experience handling shepherds. The question felt like a physical blow. Mason had known this day would come. Foster care was always temporary, a bridge to permanent placement. But he'd avoided thinking about it. He's still adjusting, he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Nightmares almost every night. Specific triggers we're still identifying. He needs stability right now. Sarah studied him with the same careful assessment she used on her patients. Mason, she said gently, are you sure this is about what Atlas needs, or is it about what you need? The question followed Mason home, echoing in his mind as he watched Atlas methodically patrol the backyard, checking the perimeter fence with the focus that had been trained into him, despite his young age. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they'd established over the past weeks, Mason allowed himself to confront the truth. He didn't want to let Atlas go. Somewhere between finding the dying puppy in the dirt and watching him transform into the alert, intelligent young dog who now trusted him enough to sleep at the foot of his bed, Atlas had become essential. Mason's phone chimed with a news alert. Another story about a military contractor under investigation for ethical violations. He'd set up notifications for keywords related to his ongoing research into Atlas's background, hoping to find answers to the questions that still lingered. As he scanned the article, a chill ran through him. The contractor mentioned Secure Paws Training Solutions was the same company he'd found referenced in several reports of missing military puppies. The investigation centered on allegations of harsh training methods and falsified records. More disturbing was the grainy image accompanying the article, a facility that looked eerily similar to one he'd driven past while taking Atlas to Sunshine. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just another anonymous industrial building on the outskirts of Phoenix. Mason zoomed in on the photo, his ranger-trained eye picking out details most would miss. The security features were excessive for a standard training facility. Motion sensors, camera arrays covering blind spots, reinforced entry points. This wasn't just a place that trained dogs. It was a place that guarded something valuable, or something incriminating. Atlas, who had been dozing on the porch, suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward. A moment later, Mason heard what the dog's superior senses had already detected. A vehicle approaching slowly, engine quieter than most, tires crunching minimally on the gravel road. Not a neighbor who would drive with the casual confidence of belonging. Not a delivery which would have turned around at the community mailboxes. Someone watching. Someone waiting. Mason casually reached for his phone, snapping several photos as a dark sedan with tinted windows cruised past his property for the third time that week. "Looks like we've got company, buddy," he murmured to Atlas, whose posture had shifted from relaxed to alert. "Question is, what are they looking for? Or who?" 3 days after spotting the suspicious sedan, Mason noticed a man in tactical pants and a polo shirt watching his house from the coffee shop across the street. The stranger's military bearing was unmistakable to Mason's trained eye. The balanced stance, the systematic way he scanned his surroundings, the concealed bulge of what was almost certainly a shoulder holster. Atlas had detected the surveillance before Mason, growing restless at the windows facing the street, his posture alternating between alert and anxious. "Someone's taken an interest in you, buddy," Mason murmured, snapping photos of the watcher with a telephoto lens borrowed from a former Ranger teammate. "Question is, why now?" "You've been with me for weeks." The answer came the following morning in the form of an official notice from Maricopa County Animal Control. A claim had been filed for Atlas by a party alleging ownership rights. A hearing was scheduled for 30 days hence, during which time Mason could maintain possession, but would be legally responsible for the dog's care and containment. "This is bullshit," Mason said, pacing Sarah's office with the notice crumpled in his fist. "Someone dumps a dog to die, covered in ticks and half-starved, then shows up months later to claim him? After I've paid thousands for his treatment." Sarah's expression was troubled as she reviewed the paperwork. "The claim appears legitimate on its face. They've provided a microchip number that matches the one we found, though not the military-grade chip embedded deeper. And they've got documentation, purchase records, training certificates." "Forgeries," Mason insisted. "Has to be." "Maybe," Sarah conceded, "but the court will need proof, not just your suspicion." The legal challenge catalyzed Mason's investigation into Atlas's origins. Using contacts from his military days, he discovered that Secure Paws Training Solutions had indeed contracted with several branches of the military to provide working dogs. Their specialty was enhanced detection training, dogs capable of identifying substances, explosives, and biological threats that eluded standard detection methods. More disturbing were the rumors that had led to the current investigation. Allegations of extreme training methods, high washout rates, and suspicious deaths among dogs that failed to meet performance standards. Former employees spoke of punishing training regimens, deprivation techniques, and harsh consequences for failure. "They treat them like equipment," said one whistleblower, whose identity had been protected in the reports. "When the equipment breaks, they dispose of it." The thought of Atlas being disposed of made Mason's blood run cold. He shared his findings with Frank during their next visit to Sunshine Senior Living, where Atlas had become something of a mascot. The residents had organized a support campaign after hearing about the ownership claim, many making handwritten signs declaring, "Atlas belongs with Mason," despite arthritic hands that made writing difficult. "They're building a case," Frank said, his tactical mind still sharp despite his age. "Establishing a paper trail to show Atlas is valuable property that was lost, not abandoned. Makes me wonder what he knows that makes him worth reclaiming." The question lingered as media interest in Atlas's case grew. The story had all the elements that captured public attention: a dramatic rescue, a heartwarming recovery, a battle over custody. Local news ran segments featuring Atlas's journey from near-death to health. The contrast between the before photos and the now alert, increasingly confident young dog created a powerful narrative. Mason found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but recognized its strategic value. Public opinion could influence the court, and visibility provided a form of protection. If too many people were watching Atlas's case, it would be harder for anyone to make him disappear again. As the hearing date approached, the surveillance became more overt. The dark sedan now regularly parked within view of Mason's house. Once he returned from a clinic visit to find his front door slightly ajar, though nothing inside appeared disturbed. Atlas's reaction told a different story. The dog refused to enter until Mason had checked every room, and then remained unusually vigilant throughout the night. Mason installed security cameras, changed his routines, and began carrying his legal concealed weapon again, precautions that felt natural after years of deployment, but surreal in the context of protecting a dog. Sarah worried about his escalating paranoia until she arrived at the clinic one morning to find someone had attempted to access the secure room where Atlas's medical records were kept. "Maybe you're not being paranoid after all," she conceded, reviewing the security footage that showed a figure in clinic scrubs using an unauthorized keycard. The legal case against Mason solidified as SecurePaws filed formal documentation claiming Atlas, referred to in their paperwork as Asset K9-2747-, had been stolen from their facility during a break-in 4 months earlier. They provided police reports, insurance claims, and training records indicating Atlas had been part of a specialized program valued at over $30,000. Mason's attorney, a former JAG officer who'd taken the case pro bono after hearing Atlas's story, found troubling inconsistencies in SecurePaws documentation. The reported break-in had conveniently affected only the section housing underperforming assets. The police report? The police report had been filed weeks after the alleged incident. The insurance claim had been processed with unusual speed. "They're covering something up," the attorney said, "but proving it won't be easy. Courts tend to favor documented ownership over emotional bonds, especially when there's significant monetary value involved." 2 weeks before the hearing, Atlas alerted Mason to a visitor at 3 a.m. Not with his usual warning bark, but with a low growl that Mason had never heard from him before. Through the security camera, Mason observed a figure in dark clothing examining the locks on his workshop. When Mason hit the exterior floodlights, the intruder fled, face concealed by a tactical mask. The incident prompted Mason to accelerate his contingency planning. If the court ruled against him, he was prepared to ensure Atlas wouldn't return to people who had discarded him once already. He researched dog-friendly states with less stringent extradition policies for animal custody cases, packed go bags for both himself and Atlas, and arranged for emergency funds to be accessible outside normal banking channels. These preparations felt like a betrayal of the law-abiding citizen he'd become since leaving the Rangers. But the alternative, returning Atlas to people who treated living creatures as disposable assets, was unthinkable. The day of the hearing arrived with a media presence that surprised even Mason. News vans lined the courthouse parking lot, and a crowd of supporters gathered on the steps, many holding signs with Atlas's photos and slogans supporting his right to remain with Mason. The residents of Sunshine Senior Living had arrived en masse, some in wheelchairs, others using walkers, their determination to support Atlas transcending physical limitations. Inside the courtroom, Mason sat with his attorney, Atlas calmly at his feet. The dog had come far from the terrified, dying creature found months earlier. Though still underweight by breed standards, his coat now gleamed, and his eyes were clear and alert. He maintained his composure despite the unfamiliar environment, a testament to both his training and the trust he'd developed in Mason's presence. SecurePaws was represented by a polished corporate legal team and a man introduced as Dr. James Harrington, the company's director of canine development. Harrington's clinical discussion of Atlas as the asset contrasted sharply with the emotional testimony of those who had participated in his rescue and rehabilitation. Sarah presented detailed medical evidence of Atlas's condition when found. The severe anemia, malnutrition, and extensive parasite infestation inconsistent with an animal that had simply escaped or been missing for a short period. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "this dog had been deliberately abandoned for weeks, possibly months, before Mr. Carter found him. The condition we documented is not consistent with a valued asset that escaped. It's consistent with systematic neglect." Elaine Patterson, her voice wavering but resolute, described Atlas's psychological trauma, his fear of men, loud noises, and confined spaces. "Whatever happened to this dog before Mason found him caused deep emotional damage," she testified. "The fact that he trusts anyone at all is a miracle, and that trust has been earned through months of patient care." The most powerful testimony came from Frank Thompson, his military bearing evident despite his age. The Vietnam veteran spoke with authority about working dogs, their training, and the bonds they formed with handlers. "I've seen what happens when these dogs are treated as equipment rather than living beings," he said, fixing Harrington with a steely gaze. "They break, not just physically, but in ways you can't fix with medicine." Atlas was broken when Mason found him, and not just from the ticks and starvation. Something broke his spirit. Frank gestured toward Atlas, who remained calmly seated beside Mason. "Look at him now. That's not the result of ownership. That's the result of partnership, of respect." The courtroom fell silent as Mason took the stand. He recounted finding Atlas, the decision to invest in his treatment, and the gradual process of building trust. He described nights spent sleeping on the floor beside the bed where Atlas hid, the small victories of each milestone in recovery, and the mounting evidence that Atlas had come from a military working dog program. "I believe Atlas was discarded because he failed to meet performance standards," Mason testified. "The documentation provided by Secure Paws, showing him as a stolen asset, directly contradicts the physical evidence of long-term neglect. Someone left him to die, and when he didn't, when he became valuable again through our care and the public attention to his case, suddenly he's worth reclaiming." As Harrington took the stand for cross-examination, Atlas's behavior changed subtly. The dog's ears flattened, his body tensed, and he pressed closer to Mason's leg, a reaction Mason had come to recognize as fear. "Atlas recognizes someone associated with his trauma," Mason whispered to his attorney, who nodded and adjusted her line of questioning. "Dr. Harrington," she began, "did you personally interact with the dog designated K9 2747 during his training?" "I oversee all advanced training candidates," Harrington replied smoothly, "but I don't handle the day-to-day conditioning." "Conditioning," the attorney repeated. "An interesting choice of words. Would you describe for the court exactly what this conditioning entails for dogs that fail to meet performance standards?" Harrington's composure slipped momentarily. "Our methods are proprietary, developed through years of scientific research to maximize operational efficiency in working dogs. And when these methods fail, what happens to the assets that don't respond appropriately to your conditioning?" The questioning continued, gradually revealing inconsistencies in Secure Paws documentation and concerning patterns in their handling of non-performing assets. As pressure mounted, Harrington's clinical demeanor gave way to defensive irritation. The breaking point came unexpectedly. During a particularly tense exchange, Harrington's voice rose sharply, and he slammed his hand on the witness stand in frustration. Atlas, triggered by the sudden movement and raised voice, let out a low, warning growl, then immediately cringed and tried to make himself smaller, as if expecting punishment for the natural response. The reaction spoke volumes about what Atlas had endured. Mason dropped to one knee beside the trembling dog, speaking softly, his own composure cracking visibly for the first time in the proceedings. "It's okay, buddy," he said, his voice breaking. "No one's going to hurt you. Not ever again, I promise." The moment, captured by courtroom cameras and instantly circulated online, crystallized the essence of the case better than any testimony could have. Here was a man who had served his country, now fighting with the same determination to protect a creature that had been broken by the system and discarded. As the hearing concluded and the judge retired to consider her ruling, Mason faced the possibility that all his efforts might not be enough. Legal ownership often trumped moral considerations in cases involving valuable property. And in the eyes of the law, that's what Atlas remained, regardless of the bond they had formed. The judge's ruling was both victory and compromise. Mason would maintain custody of Atlas pending further investigation into Secure Paw's training practices. But the court recognized the company's potential property interest and required Mason to post a substantial bond. As they left the courthouse, the crowd of supporters erupted in cheers. But Mason felt only temporary relief. The core issue remained unresolved, the threat not fully neutralized. For 3 days, life settled into a cautious rhythm. The surveillance vehicles disappeared from Mason Street. The media attention gradually shifted to newer stories. And Atlas seemed to sense the reduced tension, becoming more playful and confident. Mason allowed himself to hope that perhaps Secure Paws had decided Atlas wasn't worth the negative publicity and legal complications. On the 4th day, Atlas collapsed while playing in the backyard. One moment he was chasing a tennis ball with the exuberance of a normal young dog. The next, he lay motionless on the grass, his breathing shallow and labored. Mason carried him to the truck, heart pounding, and broke speed limits all the way to the clinic, calling Sarah en route. "His gums are white," Mason reported, glancing at Atlas's limp form on the passenger seat. "Breathing is rapid and shallow. No visible injury. It happened suddenly, no warning." Sarah and her team were waiting when Mason screeched into the clinic parking lot. They rushed Atlas inside, leaving Mason in the waiting room, his hands still trembling, Atlas's blood staining his shirt. The diagnosis, when it came, was devastating. "Internal bleeding," Sarah explained, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "The ultrasound shows a ruptured mass in his spleen. It could be a previously undetected injury that's finally given way, or—" She hesitated, and Mason knew what she wasn't saying. "Or it could be deliberate," he finished for her. "Slow-acting poison, delayed-release toxin." His ranger training had familiarized him with such methods, though he'd never imagined they'd be used against a dog. "We need to operate immediately," Sarah continued. "The bleeding is severe." "Even with surgery, his chances are—" She swallowed hard. "Mason, you need to prepare yourself." The surgery lasted 4 hours. Mason paced the waiting room until Frank and Elaine arrived, alerted by the clinic staff. The elderly veterans sat with him in silent solidarity as the minutes crawled by. Other Sunshine residents began appearing, setting up an impromptu vigil that spilled into the clinic's parking lot.
"Well, that dog's a fighter," Frank said, his gnarled hand gripping Mason's shoulder. "Survived worse than this." When Sarah finally emerged from surgery, her scrubs stained with blood, her expression told Mason everything before she spoke. "We removed his spleen and repaired the bleeding sites, but he's lost a dangerous amount of blood. He needs a transfusion immediately, and his blood type is rare." She ran a hand through her hair, leaving a smear of Atlas's blood near her temple. "I've called every clinic and donor in our network. Nothing available within transport distance." "Sergeant," Frank said immediately. "My dog. He donated before. Same type." "Frank, Sergeant gave a large donation just months ago," Sarah explained gently. "It wouldn't be safe." "Damn safety," the old veteran interrupted. "That boy needs help. Sergeant will give what he can." Sergeant was brought in within the hour, the stoic, older dog seeming to understand the urgency as the technicians prepared him for the blood draw. Mason knelt beside him, overwhelmed by the gift being offered. "Thank you," he whispered to the dog, who responded with a dignified tolerance of the procedure. Even with the transfusion, Atlas's condition remained critical. His body, still recovering from months of malnutrition and abuse, had few reserves to draw upon. The monitor tracking his heartbeat beeped with a rhythm that seemed increasingly fragile. Mason refused to leave, setting up camp in Atlas's recovery area. Sarah, breaking numerous protocols, allowed him to stay, recognizing that Atlas responded to Mason's presence even in his unconscious state, his vital signs strengthening slightly whenever Mason spoke. 24 hours, Sarah told Mason privately. "If he makes it through the next 24 hours, he has a fighting chance." "But Mason," she placed a hand on his arm, "the clinic board is concerned about the mounting costs. They've been generous, but this surgery, the ICU care, the blood products, we're well beyond what our charity fund can absorb." Mason stared at her, the implications sinking in. "Are you saying the clinic might stop treatment? After everything he's been through?" Sarah's expression was pained. "I'm saying we need to consider all options, including what's most humane if his condition deteriorates further. The board has authorized care through tomorrow. After that..." The unfinished sentence hung between them. Mason nodded mechanically, unable to process the possibility of losing Atlas after coming so far, of making the decision to end his suffering if recovery proved impossible. Night fell, and the clinic grew quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the occasional movements of the overnight staff. Mason sat beside Atlas's kennel, one hand extended through the bars to maintain contact with the unconscious dog. "You listen to me, Atlas," he whispered. "We didn't come this far for you to give up now. You survived being abandoned. You survived the ticks. You survived those bastards at Secure Paws. You can survive this, too." His voice broke as exhaustion and emotion finally overwhelmed his military discipline. "I need you to fight, buddy. I need you because you're the first thing that's made sense to me since Afghanistan. The first time I've felt like I'm doing something that matters." In the dim light of the recovery area, Mason's mind drifted to darker possibilities. If Atlas recovered, the threat from Secure Paws remained. If treatment became too expensive to continue, Mason faced an impossible choice. And underneath it all lingered the suspicion that Atlas's sudden collapse was not accident, but sabotage, that someone had found a way to harm him despite Mason's vigilance.
Dawn brought no improvement. Atlas remained unconscious, his breathing shallow, his once vibrant presence reduced to data points on monitoring equipment. Sarah's morning assessment was cautiously delivered but clear in its implications. Atlas was failing despite their best efforts. "His kidney values are climbing," she explained, showing Mason the lab results. "That's a sign his body is shutting down. We can continue supportive care, but at some point, we need to consider quality of life." The clinic board convened an emergency meeting to discuss the case. Mason was not invited, but could see them through the conference room window. Serious faces, documents being passed around, occasional glances toward the recovery area where Atlas lay fighting for his life. Frank arrived mid-morning, bringing coffee and a quiet strength that Mason desperately needed. "When I was in the jungle," the old veteran said, "cut off from my unit for 3 days, my dog Brenner kept me going, wouldn't let me give up, even when I wanted to." He nodded toward Atlas's still form. "Some battles are fought together. Some you have to fight alone. He's fighting his now." The clinic board's decision, delivered by Sarah with evident reluctance, was both expected and devastating. The clinic would provide care through the end of the day. If Atlas showed no improvement, they would recommend humane euthanasia. If Mason wished to transfer Atlas to another facility, he would need to cover all outstanding balances, nearly $20,000, and arrange transport himself. As the reality of potentially losing Atlas settled over him, Mason faced the darkest moment of his journey, with the dog who had somehow become the center of his fragmented life. How had a chance encounter with a dying puppy led to this? To a grief that felt as raw and consuming as losing his teammates in combat. In the sterile quiet of the recovery area, Mason made the hardest call of his life. "I need to speak with someone at Secure Paws," he told the receptionist who answered. "Tell them I'm ready to discuss returning their asset." Mason waited in the clinic parking lot, the desert sun baking the asphalt beneath his boots. He'd chosen this location deliberately, public, visible from the street, security cameras covering every angle. If Secure Paws wanted their asset back, they wouldn't be able to disappear him without witnesses. A black SUV with government plates pulled in precisely at the agreed time. Mason tensed as the driver's door opened, and a man in military-style tactical pants and a polo shirt emerged. Not Harrington from the court hearing, but someone with the same bearing, rigid posture, calculating eyes, the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to violence. "Mr. Carter," the man said, extending his hand. "Richard Townsend. I understand you're ready to discuss our property." Mason didn't take the offered hand. "I want to see credentials, real ones, not Secure Paws corporate ID." Townsend studied Mason for a long moment, then reached into his jacket. The ID he produced bore the Department of Defense seal and identified him as a special investigator with the Military Working Dog Program. "You're not with Secure Paws," Mason said, scrutinizing the ID. "No, Mr. Carter, I am most certainly not." Townsend's voice carried the crisp precision of career military. "May we speak somewhere private? I believe we have mutual interests regarding Atlas, or as he was designated in our program, Ranger." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Ranger. His old unit. The coincidence seemed impossible. Inside Sarah's office, with the blinds drawn and Atlas still fighting for life in the recovery area down the hall, Townsend revealed a truth that upended everything Mason thought he knew.
"I've been tracking stolen military working dogs for 18 months, Townsend explained, spreading photographs across Sarah's desk. Specifically, dogs from our advanced detection program that were diverted to private contractors. Atlas, Ranger, was one of our most promising candidates before he disappeared from the training facility at Davis-Monthan." The photos showed multiple German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois in various stages of training. One image, showing a young Atlas with a distinctive white patch on his chest, was labeled Ranger Phase 2 Detection Training. "We initially believed it was an inside theft ring," Townsend continued. "Staff selling promising puppies to private contractors who could profit from their preliminary training. But the reality was more disturbing. SecurePaws had infiltrated our program, falsifying transfer paperwork and redirecting dogs to their own facility." Mason's mind raced, connecting dots that had previously seemed random. Their training methods. Brutally efficient and completely unauthorized, Townsend confirmed. They push these dogs beyond ethical limits, using methods our program explicitly prohibits. Dogs that couldn't withstand their enhanced conditioning were discarded. "Left to die," Mason said, anger rising in his throat. "Precisely. The dogs that survived became valuable assets in SecurePaws' private security contracts. The company charged premium rates for detection services that legitimate programs wouldn't provide, searching without warrants, working in conditions too dangerous for properly valued working dogs. And you've been watching me because... ? When Atlas appeared in the news, I recognized him immediately. The white chest marking is distinctive, and his behavioral responses confirmed it. I've been gathering evidence, documenting his recovery, building a case against SecurePaws, while trying to determine if you were connected to the theft ring. Mason's laugh was bitter. You thought I stole him, then nearly killed him with neglect, then spent thousands saving him? That's one hell of a cover story. Townsend's expression remained impassive. I've encountered stranger operations, Mr. Carter. Your Ranger background made you a person of interest. But after observing you with Atlas, reviewing the medical documentation, and speaking with the staff here, I'm satisfied you had no prior connection to SecurePaws. Great. So you've cleared me. Meanwhile, Atlas is dying down the hall, and the clinic can't afford to keep treating him. Mason leaned forward, desperation edging his voice. Are you here to help him, or just to close your case? Both. Townsend removed a thick envelope from his jacket. The department has a significant interest in Atlas's recovery, both for his value as evidence and because we don't abandon our working dogs. This should cover his immediate medical expenses. The envelope contained a government payment voucher for $30,000. There are conditions, Townsend continued as Mason stared at the document. Atlas remains under your care as his designated handler, but technically, he'll be reinstated to the military working dog program as an evidence asset. You'll need to make him available for certain evaluations and possible court appearances as our case against SecurePaws proceeds. And after the case closes, what happens to him then? Townsend's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the dog handler beneath the investigator's exterior. Military working dogs can be adopted by their handlers upon completion of service. Given the bond you formed and the extraordinary circumstances, I believe that outcome could be arranged. Mason struggled to process this sudden reversal of fortune. Why not tell me this from the beginning? Why the surveillance, the mystery?
We couldn't be certain who was involved in the theft ring. SecurePaws has connections in multiple agencies. Until we knew your role, limited contact was protocol. Townsend hesitated, then added, and frankly, we needed to evaluate your suitability as a handler. Atlas, Ranger, was one of our most promising detection candidates before his trauma. His future needs to be with someone who understands both his potential and his limitations. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah rushing into the office, her face flushed with urgency. Mason, you need to come now. Atlas is crashing. The recovery room had transformed into a flurry of controlled chaos. Veterinary technicians worked around Atlas's still form, administering medications, checking vital signs, preparing emergency equipment. The monitor tracking his heart rate showed an erratic pattern, the beeps irregular and weakening. He's going into shock, Sarah explained, pulling on gloves. Blood pressure's dropping. Heart rate's unstable. We need to act immediately. Mason stood frozen, watching the life drain from the dog he'd fought so hard to save. Townsend appeared at his side, his professional demeanor replaced with the urgency of someone who understood what was at stake. Dr. Williams, Townsend said, extending the payment voucher, the Department of Defense is assuming financial responsibility for this animal, effective immediately. Spare no treatment, regardless of cost. Sarah glanced at the document, then back at Mason, who nodded. Do whatever you have to do, just save him. The next hour passed in a blur of medical interventions. Additional blood products were rushed from a nearby emergency clinic. A specialist was called in. The treatment area became a battlefield where every piece of equipment, every medication, every skilled hand fought to pull Atlas back from the brink. Through it all, Mason remained at Atlas's side, speaking constantly to the unconscious dog, willing him to keep fighting. Frank arrived with Sergeant, the older dog seemingly distressed by his young friend's condition, whining softly outside the treatment area. I told you we aren't finished, Mason whispered to Atlas as the monitors continued their ominous beeping. You hear me? We have work to do. You're a military working dog, Ranger, and Rangers lead the way. That means you don't quit, not now, not after everything. The crisis point came without warning. One moment the machines beeped their irregular rhythm. The next, they emitted the continuous tone that signaled cardiac arrest. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, administering emergency drugs, while a technician began chest compressions on Atlas's limp body. Come on, Sarah muttered, watching the monitor for any response. Mason felt the world narrowed to this single point in time, this moment when everything he'd fought for hung in balance. The rational part of his mind registered Townsend stepping back to give the medical team room, Frank's hand gripping his shoulder. The hushed voices of clinic staff gathered in the hallway. But his focus remained entirely on Atlas, willing the dog's heart to beat again. The flatline continued its merciless tone, seconds stretching into what felt like eternity. Sarah administered another dose of emergency medication, her movements becoming more urgent. He's a fighter, Mason said, his voice hoarse. He'll come back. Sarah met his eyes briefly, compassion and regret mingling in her expression. Mason, we need to consider, the monitor chirped. Then again, a weak, irregular pattern appeared on the screen as Atlas's heart stuttered back into rhythm. Pressure's rising, a technician reported. We've got cardiac activity. The room collectively exhaled. Sarah quickly adjusted medication dosages, her hands steady despite the adrenaline of the moment. He's responding, but he's not stable. The next few hours are critical. As the immediate crisis passed, the treatment area quieted. The specialist remained to monitor Atlas's condition, but most of the team dispersed, leaving Mason once again at the kennel's edge, one hand extended to maintain contact with the unconscious dog. "You're officially the most stubborn patient I've ever had," Sarah said, reviewing Atlas's updated vitals. "Most dogs wouldn't have survived that episode." "He's not most dogs," Mason replied, his voice rough with emotion. From the doorway, Townsend watched with an expression that had softened considerably since their first meeting. "No," he agreed quietly. "He most certainly is not." 6 months later, the desert bloomed after rare autumn rains, transforming the arid landscape surrounding Mason's small ranch house into a tapestry of unexpected color. Atlas, still Atlas to Mason, despite his official reinstatement as Ranger in military records, raced through puddles in the backyard, his powerful body sleek and healthy, bearing little resemblance to the skeletal creature Mason had found dying in the dirt. The German Shepherd had made a miraculous recovery, defying medical expectations with the same tenacity that had kept him alive when abandoned. 3 weeks after his near-death experience, he had been discharged from the clinic, still weak but steadily improving. Now, at approximately 1 year old, he had blossomed into a magnificent example of his breed, intelligent, loyal, and surprisingly gentle despite his military training background. Mason watched from the porch as Atlas investigated a jackrabbit trail, his movements precise and methodical, the detection training reasserting itself in ordinary moments. The relationship between man and dog had evolved into something neither military protocol nor rescue sentimentality could adequately describe. They had healed each other, filling gaps in each other's broken places. "He's showing off for company," Frank observed, settling into a rocking chair beside Mason. At 82, the Vietnam veteran moved more slowly these days, but his mind remained sharp. "Knows Richard is watching." Townsend stood at the edge of the property, speaking quietly into a satellite phone. Over the past months, he had become a regular visitor as Atlas participated in the case building against Secure Paws. The Department of Defense investigation had expanded beyond stolen dogs to encompass contract fraud, illegal detention techniques, and animal cruelty charges. Harrington and 3 other executives now faced federal indictments. "Atlas knows who butters his bread," Mason replied with a smile, watching the dog deliberately showcase his scent detection skills along the fence line. "Shows off his training whenever Richard's around, like he's applying for his old job back." Frank chuckled. "Can you blame him?" Being officially reinstated as a military working dog comes with better health care than most veterans get. His weathered face grew more serious, though I suspect he'd choose you over the job if it came to that. The comment touched on Mason's lingering concern. Atlas's extraordinary abilities hadn't disappeared despite his trauma. Under Townsend's careful guidance, Mason had helped Atlas rechannel his military training toward constructive purposes, maintaining his detection skills without the punishing methods Secure Paws had employed. The dog now helped locate lost hikers as part of a volunteer search and rescue team, his enhanced scent capabilities saving lives rather than serving corporate interests. But Mason sometimes wondered if he was being selfish, keeping Atlas as a companion when his abilities could serve a greater purpose. Townsend had hinted more than once that Atlas could return to modified duty if Mason were willing to serve as his handler. The decision had been postponed, while the Secure Paws case proceeded. But with the trial date approaching, Mason knew the question would soon require an answer. The thought of returning Atlas to any form of military service made his stomach knot with anxiety, memories of Cato's death in Afghanistan still haunting his dreams. "Your friends are here," Frank said, nodding toward an approaching van bearing the Sunshine Senior Living logo. Mason's regular Tuesday visitor program had expanded significantly since Atlas's recovery. What began as casual visits had evolved into a formal therapy program, with Atlas now a certified therapy dog, making regular rounds at hospitals, veteran centers, and retirement communities throughout the Phoenix area. Elaine Patterson supervised these excursions with clipboard efficiency, having found renewed purpose in coordinating what she called Atlas's Ministry of Presence. Today, she had brought 5 residents from Sunshine, including Margaret Wilson, whose theory about Atlas's special operations training had proven remarkably accurate. "There's our miracle boy," Margaret called as Atlas raced to greet the visitors, his tail wagging with genuine enthusiasm. The seniors had been among his most devoted supporters during his recovery, and Atlas seemed to sense their fragility, adapting his exuberant greeting into a gentler interaction. Mason's modest ranch had become an unexpected community hub. What began as a solitary existence had transformed into a life rich with connections. Sarah stopping by with medical updates and homemade meals. Frank bringing Sergeant for canine consultations. Sunshine residents visiting for what they called Atlas therapy. Even Townsend contributing his expertise in working dog psychology. The nonprofit Mason had established, Second Chance Canine, had grown from a vague idea to a functioning organization. With seed funding from a grateful family whose child Atlas had found during a search operation, the program now connected rescue dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD. Mason trained both dogs and handlers, drawing on his experiences with Atlas to create partnerships built on mutual healing rather than command and control. "The reporter's here," Sarah announced, joining the gathering on the porch. The local news station that had first covered Atlas's story was producing a follow-up feature, documenting his journey from near death to therapy dog success. The resulting publicity would help fund the nonprofit's expansion, though Mason still felt uncomfortable in the spotlight. "You ready for your close-up?" he asked Atlas, who responded by pressing against his leg in what had become their silent signal of mutual support. "Yeah, me neither, but it's for a good cause." As the afternoon progressed and the house filled with visitors, Mason found himself momentarily overwhelmed. A year ago, he had lived in self-imposed isolation, his days structured around solitary routines designed to keep memories at bay. Now his quiet existence had been replaced by purpose and connection, all because he'd stopped to investigate a whimper on a deserted lot. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, finding him alone in the kitchen as he prepared coffee for the guests. "Just thinking about how one decision can change everything," he replied. "If I hadn't been late for work that day, if I'd taken a different route." Sarah's hand found his, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent in recent months. "But you did, and here we are." Her smile held warmth that extended beyond professional camaraderie. "Atlas isn't the only one who's transformed, you know. The Mason Carter I met a year ago wouldn't have opened his home to a house full of octogenarians and reporters." The observation was accurate, but incomplete. The truth was more complex. How saving Atlas had somehow saved him. How fighting for the dog's life had given him a reason to fully engage with his own again. The nightmares hadn't disappeared, but they had diminished,
often replaced by Atlas's solid presence at the foot of his bed. The one-year anniversary of Atlas's rescue was celebrated with a community gathering at Sunshine Senior Living. Residents who rarely participated in activities emerged from their rooms to be part of what they considered a victory celebration, not just for Atlas, but for everyone who had contributed to his journey. Mason, uncomfortable with public speaking but recognizing the importance of the moment, had prepared remarks. Standing before the assembled crowd, with Atlas sitting attentively at his side, he found himself abandoning his prepared notes for something more genuine. "A year ago I found a dying dog in the dirt," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his chest. "I didn't know then that I was also finding my way back to life. Atlas survived because many of you in this room refused to give up on him, even when the odds seemed impossible. What you might not realize is how many lives he's touched since then." He gestured toward a bulletin board where photos displayed Atlas's therapy visits. A child in a cancer ward smiling for the first time in weeks. An elderly veteran reaching out to touch Atlas's fur with trembling hands. A traumatized teenager gradually emerging from silence during regular sessions with the patient German Shepherd. "They say rescue goes both ways," Mason continued. "The truth is, rescue ripples outward, touching lives far beyond what we can see. Atlas isn't just my dog, or a therapy dog, or even a reinstated military working dog. He's a reminder that what looks broken beyond repair can become something extraordinary with the right care." The gathering transitioned to a reception where Atlas performed a demonstration of his detection skills, adapted into a game that delighted both children and seniors, Townsend observed with professional appreciation, occasionally exchanging technical observations with Frank, whose military dog-handling experience remained relevant despite the decades that had passed. Later that evening, as the guests departed and the house quieted, Mason sat on the porch steps with Atlas beside him. The German Shepherd's head rested on his knee, a position of trust that still sometimes caught Mason by surprise, given their difficult beginning. "Big day, buddy," Mason said, running his hand along Atlas's back. "You were a star." The letters that had arrived following the news coverage lay in a stack on Mason's desk inside. Heartfelt notes from people across the country who had been moved by Atlas's story. Many sharing tales of their own rescue dogs, some offering donations to the nonprofit, others simply expressing gratitude for a story of resilience in difficult times. Atlas lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked forward, alerting to something beyond human perception. Then he relaxed, settling back against Mason with a contented sigh. Those eyes, once filled with pain and fear, reflecting the worst of human cruelty, now gazed at the world with calm confidence and trust. In them, Mason saw not just the journey they had traveled together, but the path ahead, uncertain, perhaps, but no longer walked alone. When Mason found Atlas, a dying German Shepherd covered in ticks, he never imagined this broken creature would restore his own broken spirit. Their journey reminds us that it's never too late for a second chapter. Many of us understand the emptiness of days that blend together, the quiet homes that once bustled with purpose. Like Atlas, we too can find unexpected joy after profound loss. Through every setback, the custody battle, Atlas's near-death experience, the long nights of uncertainty, Mason discovered that healing happens in community. The seniors at Sunshine Living didn't just support Atlas, they reclaimed their own sense of purpose.
They proved that wisdom and compassion don't diminish with age, but grow more powerful. Atlas's story speaks to anyone who's ever felt discarded, overlooked, or past their prime. It whispers the truth we sometimes forget. Our capacity to love and be loved remains our greatest strength until our final breath. What unexpected blessing has changed your life when you least expected it? Has an animal companion ever helped you through a difficult season? Please share your stories in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.